Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all. So I've been at Kansas State University for about 9 years. And I guess just to tell you a little bit about myself, why I choose to teach is I really like to help students kind of get that aha moment. Not that I'm the one that's giving that information, because I think that's what's really changed the game, is getting access to the information is no longer the issue. It's really how do you take that information and put that into an actionable decision, not only as a student, but also as a grower, as a farmer. You start thinking about the resources we have, how limited they can be, growing population, how do we do that? And I think one of the key players in this conversation really isn't, well, might be here, I just don't know my student body as well as I probably should, but we're going to talk about Charlie for a moment, who's a wheat grower in his kind of late 50s, kind of a typical stereotypical grower, mesh hat, right? Dirty, dusty, sweat stained. You know, you've been in the field several hours running the tractor. But this particular day was a little bit different. Different in the sense that, you know, went down the road, dust kicking up, 3 weeks, no rain, 4 weeks, no rain. Very typical to this particular year. Going up to the fence that he normally checks on a more routine basis, because he also has cattle. He also checks the water for those cattle. But this day it was a little different. He thought, you know, it's been some time since I've checked my wheat field. It's right along the fence line. I'm just going to take some time, go for a walk. So it's kind of one of those kick the dirt kind of walks, like we sometimes do, and maybe a new idea comes. It's something that my dad taught me. Take time with it, walk around. In this particular case, walking down that fence row, checking things as normal, sees something from the corner of his eye, just caught his attention, okay? And, right, change in perspective, now moving closer, getting a little bit closer. As he gets closer, he's noticing that the wheat does not look normal. Starting to get yellow, patchy. This really wasn't his wheat, not by any sense of the word. It wasn't his. As he's getting closer, his walk starts to slow down a bit. Gets that sigh going, something's not right. Something's not right. This is something I haven't seen before. It's not herbicide injury. I've seen that before. These are kind of like patches. They're kind of contiguous, but not. I don't really know how to describe this. And then all of a sudden, this rush of questions comes to his mind. How long has this been here? What do my other fields look like? Is this really extend through the entire field? I've just seen one small snapshot. And was this something that I could have prevented? Is this something that I should have done? Now, it's in that case where we really want the answer to be, well, they should have had, right, a major NRES. They should have had some education. They should have had this piece. But the reality of it, you think about all the information that really goes into making those decisions, whether they're split decisions, something new that comes up, versus we're managing a crop. We've been doing that for 20 years. He remembers when his dad was telling him how to farm that particular piece of ground. He remembers when that barn was there and is no longer there, and the trouble he's had since his dad's been away, right? His dad passed away. All that historical knowledge is gone. He's still trying to manage that field. So all these things are rushing to his head, and the last thing on his mind is, I better contact Brian, right? Right? That's really not the reality. I better go ask Brian what he thinks. No. The connection is to the land. The connection is to that crop. The connection is to the history there, let alone to tell somebody else who he doesn't really trust or doesn't know to help solve the problem. So we start talking about natural resources and managing these resources and bringing people to the discussion that are actually in charge of those resources as an outsider trying to produce data that then leads to, right, actionable information. There's a connection that needs to be made, in many cases is not. And that's really fundamental to doing this well, especially when you start thinking about this, right, on a global scale. Yep, this is an old slide, just bear with me, it's now 2017. Everybody has seen these numbers, right? But let's think about just the food producers. Take Charlie for the moment and multiply Charlie by as many growers as we have, but it's the same amount of land that we have to produce that food. Okay, now we start bringing in all these other resources that we need to start thinking about when we manage that small sliver of land. We can actually do something with it. Then you start thinking about the factors that we don't have control over, right? Maybe there's some things that we could be doing different to manage those particular environmental changes. That's another conversation. But think about in terms of what resources do we have? How is that environment changing? How are we starting to use those food sources? Are we using it for food? Are we using it for fuel? How is that fuel used to manage those food resources? Right, these are all the things that Charlie's thinking about when he's looking at that wheat for that first time in a different way. And trying to manage all this other information and knowledge base to make some decisions. Right? And really the challenge in this is, again, the amount of land. We can't just say, hey, let's take all this ocean and turn it into land, right? We can't do that. We can't, not yet, right? Maybe. But we're thinking about this more broadly, but how do we intensify, right, that same piece of ground, but do it in a way that's actually sustainable? I guess this is where my part fits in with when we start thinking about entomology and pest management is, what I really get my students to think about, I'm going to ask you is, what is a pest? Really, what is a pest? I know this is supposed to be a seminar lecture, but I'm going to ask for some feedback. What is a pest? We're just going to start, that's all I'm really going to ask you is, what is a pest?
Something that's ruining crops.
Okay, something, organism that's ruining a crop, okay? Others? I know you know. Just be bold.
Something that just bothers you.
Something that annoys you, yeah? Yeah, so my oldest would say the younger two are pests, right? So my boys were 12, 10, and almost 12, 10, and they would say that the other two are pests, right? But something that's annoying you, okay?
Something that affects you in a negative way.
Okay, something that affects you in a negative way. Who's growing the crop? It's a human. Everybody see the pattern I'm going here? Pest is a human-derived idea. Pests don't exist without us. So all those aphids that I see in the context that I look at them could be a pest because it's affecting my crop. Or they're actually feeding beneficial organisms to keep them around and make my system more resilient. It's all in how I perceive it. And pest is a perception. It's how we think about our world and our resources in that way. How do we manage those resources? So let's just talk about this connection between, right, what you're doing in this degree program, right? What's the expectation is to take some of this knowledge and apply this to managing water and land and energy, right? That's the basic premise, right, from my understanding. Let's just think about this now and put a real-world example with some data around this. Now, I'm not expecting you for this part of it. I'm going to go through this on purpose quickly, and it's to make a point, okay? So don't get too nervous about all the data that I'm throwing at you, but I want to make a point, okay? So remember we talked about Charlie and this, right, his little patch of whatever's there, right? Now we're just going to actually put a real-world example here, which is an invasive species. In this case, a soybean aphid. Before 2001, it wasn't here, at least that we didn't detect. 75 million acres of soybean in the north central. 10,000 of that acres was maybe treated once a decade with an insecticide. You introduce one aphid species in here that can reduce yields 40 to 60%, and you have half of that 75 million acres treated with an insecticide every year to make sure you don't lose yield. You don't lose the farm, literally. At that time was, $12, $14, $16 a bushel, so that means something in a much greater context of a landscape. There's one species introduced, completely disrupt the system, right? So we've actually learned quite a bit since that time. So let's just go through what we've learned, because we're supposed to apply this knowledge, right? And we're expecting that grower who's managing those resources it's a natural resource, there's land, I'm doing something with it. I'm expecting water to interact, all these things. What do we expect them to really know to make a decision on? So let's go through that. I'm going to go through this quickly. Again, this is by purpose. But let's just think about the complexity is what I want you to focus on. Think about the complexity of what I'm showing you. Okay, it has a very complex life cycle. Actually, it requires a different host. So this is its primary host, which is an invasive species. It's buckthorn. It's a woody shrub that's in the understory. In order for that woody shrub to be there, you need an invasive worm to take down the duff layer so that other species don't grow, like oak. and you have you have an invasive that does take over the understory for that to be successful. This has to be here for a soybean aphid to fly, go through sexual forms, go through sexual reproduction on this host, otherwise it doesn't survive. So you actually need the starlings that were introduced to break down the the seed that was produced by the buckthorn for it to then be on a fence line, which is usually right next to the soybean field, which is where, right? So you start to see that this only happens because we brought some species in. We didn't bring the soybean aphid in, right? But we allowed a system for it to happen because of the way we manage. And we can go through the life cycle, and oh, by the way, they go through an egg form, right? And where these overwinter, depends on how cold you are, like minus 29°C at the point at which they freeze and then they die. This is why I moved away from Minnesota. I love Minnesota, but this is why I moved away. The probability of that happening is pretty high the further north you get. That makes sense, right? Unless your climates are changing, your winters are getting warmer, and all of a sudden that line starts to move up. Well, if that line starts to move up and you know that there's buckthorn more prevalent in those areas, there's more likely of overwintering. So if you're going to ask me as a grower, what's the likelihood of having soybean aphid, I might then have to ask you questions about where is this thing located, how much overwintering was there likely to be movement from one field to the next, and then they need to know how many aphids are on that plant, how much yield is actually causing them, how much yield loss is being caused. They need to know that. You don't just spray when you see one. There's a certain threshold which you reach. So it declines as you get higher aphid densities. That makes sense. But you have to know where that falls, right? You can't just say, I have an aphid, I got to spray it. Especially if I want to bring in predators, especially if I want to think about the economics behind it. It's not feasible. Right? And then if I have an aphid population today, what's it really going to do 4 days from now when I actually apply something? Well, I have to know something about the population dynamics. I have to know about the ecology, right? What are the birth rates, death rates, minus immigration, plus immigration, minus emigration, right? What's giving birth, what's dying, what's coming in, what's leaving? Simple, right? Simple. That's stuff you know. Not really, right? Because you think about the complexity of knowing the dynamics, how much that change is going to happen. It could actually be, do I have a seed treatment? Do I have a resistant variety? Where was that planted? What was the planting date? Where in the canopy was that aphid located? Oh, what was the temperature, right? So we can actually start with their exotherms, so they rely on the external temperatures to manipulate their bodily functions, to grow, to replicate, to develop. And we can say, well, they don't develop here versus they die at a higher temperature, and we can start to model those things, but then you have to know what the temperature is at which the time you recorded them. Oh, by the way, this also changes based on growth stage, so it depends on when the aphids come in, as far as how fast the population is going to grow or decline based on the growth stage of the soybean. So now you have to know something about the growth stage of the soybean, what that's going to do in the next week or so, and what the aphid population is going to do. Remember I told you I was going to speak fast through here for a reason. It's hopefully proving a point. Oh, we're talking about one species. We're talking about one species right now, just one. We're talking about one species. Oh, by the way, not only that, by the overall growth stage of the plant, but where they're located in the plant will affect how fast the population grows. So you're more likely to grow 3 times as fast if you're in the top part of the canopy than you are at the bottom part of the canopy. And oh, by the way, where that actually is through time changes. So they tend to be in the top part of the canopy early. There's also predation that happens that drives some of that to the lower parts of the canopy. But if you say the threshold is 250, now the question is, where are they? Because that matters, right? Matters where are they and what stage the soybean is in. And then natural enemies, like I said, shift that, can help. They can help at the same time. Where'd they come from? What did I do around that field to increase their numbers or decrease their numbers? And not all plants are equal. And not all aphids are equal. So they all look like the same species, but we have these biotypes that start occurring that can actually overcome resistance. So just plant a resistant variety until I now have a biotype in the environment that actually overcomes that resistance. So I'd expect to be no yield loss. Now there's yield loss. So everybody think about Charlie for a moment. Okay? Coming over that hill. Now you see that Maybe you're feeling it too if I all said this is all be on the test, right? All of a sudden you have a rush of, well, I should have paid attention. I should know these things. I need to use that knowledge to apply that to managing a resource, right? How easy is that? That's a reality. That's one species. You might be dealing with a complex of 5 or 6 within a crop. Maybe one really strong, like really big perennial pest that would deal with consistent one year to the next, but some of them are occasional. A lot of them are migratory, so we have to know what they're doing outside of Kansas before they even get here to know what kind of impact they're going to have. The immigration, right? Right, so if you found that, what are you going to do? This is your field of wheat. What are you going to do? And I'm jumping, this is a different crop. Different set of pests, different set of requirements, different set of knowledge base, different knowledge base. What are you going to do? Leave it?
Call Brian.
Call Brian, right? Yeah, exactly. Call Brian. Unless he's in Australia. What are you going to do?
Pray you have insurance.
Okay. Who said leave it? How come?
Because it's a ladybug larva and they eat aphids.
Yeah, actually, if you can start eliminating a lot of these questions that you know the answer to, right? This is deductive reasoning. You can say, here's my knowledge base, here's my diagnostic mind. I can start answering questions based on what I see in an image, right? And then use that information to make an informed decision. You just needed that knowledge base to know that that was an immature lady beetle larva, or that was an immature lady beetle feeding on an aphid. Why on earth would you try to remove that from the system? Especially if this is providing biological control for the next crop, whatever that might be, as this is senescing, right? Also, what else do you see? The wheat is closer to maturity, right? This is on a wheat head. How much loss are you really occurring by any aphids that are there? I didn't tell you any of that, but you have to look at the image. Start pulling the diagnostic information out to make those decisions. How do we do that? Well, you have to have a broad. Does this look familiar? Does this look oddly familiar, right? So I did my homework too, trying to figure out how my talk and what I do fits into here. But hopefully you can kind of see the managing even an agri-ecosystem resource that depends on all these other natural resources. You can't separate the two. There's no big bubble. There's no Truman Show. Is that a reference that nobody's get? Still get that one? Okay, there's no Truman Show here. We're not creating our own environment within which we operate. Thank goodness there's not that many cameras either. So what do we do with this? We take that information, but it's also dependent on where and when we are and what we're growing. And some of these factors we can start to contribute to having something that's more accessible. In this case, this is where the technology, so that was the ecology. Start to think about the ecology and pest management all wrapped into one. You have to know something about birth and death and immigration, and then the strategies that you deploy to affect those dynamics. At the same time, what information are you accessing? Where do you get it from? And how accessible really is it? Well, right? If anybody, tell me when you start remembering that this was, right? Is anybody, oh yeah, that's the longer I show this slide, the more dated I become, but that's fine. I remember my dad having a bag phone in the truck, right? Paid a lot for it, but he was on the road a lot. These things, not a lot of reception, but now almost anywhere on such a small device, right? You start thinking about what we could really do with that, what we've been able to do with that kind of computing power. You've seen stuff like this float around, like, yeah, we can get to the moon. But you don't just get to the moon with technology. Everybody hear that? You don't get to the moon with just technology. What else do you need to get to the moon?
Resources.
Okay, resources. Give me one of the key resources.
Like brain power?
Yeah, people. Yeah, you have the technology, but if you don't have the people to get there, or the people in a direction, right? Some plan of action that you need, then really you're going nowhere. You're spinning your wheels. You don't know how to manage something because you don't have the right direction. You don't have the right question. Everybody see that? So the technology is there, but how we start blending that with what we know and the people that we work with, because some of that might rely on a kind of a crowdsourced solution. So the way we see the web has changed a lot. You know, this kind of idea of Web 2.0. Now we don't even think about it because it's just a natural part of what we do. Instead of being online, or we're being online instead of going online, like we're connected. Not going somewhere to do that, but we're connected. Things are coming to us. There's a social affiliation. There's a digital self-expression, right? In some cases, really annoying digital self-expression. Things that make you go, I'm going to hide this person. Like you're making some type of affiliation with that person online, right? And also you're expressing yourself in a certain way. But here's the key part. You're participating in the web process. It used to be, here's data, look at it. Now it's not only here's data, look at it. I can tell you what you clicked on, where you went to next. I can tell you all that stuff, as long as you go to my site. I'm using all that exhaust to sell you products in a more efficient way, or giving you a better experience. Now think about all that we're doing with with Amazon type data. And now think about it in the context of managing a farm. All the data we have and all those pieces that are just scattered like a scarecrow, right? Wizard of Oz. You gotta start putting those pieces back together again. And everybody has their own footprint. So this doesn't require everybody to participate at the same level. This means realizing what your level is to participate, realizing what your stakeholders' level is to participate, and realizing what kind of network you can really create to have something that's a good solution. Unfortunately, a lot of the land-grant systems don't have this set up yet in the way it should be. More of it's kind of a trickle down of information, right? The research gets done, that goes to extension. Extension works with the growers and the advisors, and they communicate. And then because we have to generalize and wave our hands quite a bit and say, I don't know because there's 20 more questions I have to ask you, we start to generalize across the farmscape. Now I'm going to make one little switch in the model. Okay, watch. What happened? What happened? Okay, everybody see the difference? What moved? What was the one new connection I made?
Research.
2 new connections. Huh?
Research is linked to the farm site.
Research is linked to the farm site. An extension is linked to the farm site. Okay? If I start asking questions on a specific field basis and I get field history associated with that, and I know there's an intent and a direction, we can get to the moon. But in order to do that, I need to think about what resources I have available. In a lot of cases, it's not removing extension from this piece, it's making them more efficient. It's thinking about facilitating networks, not just extending programs. I got a piece of information, here, go use it. But it's, here's the information, here's when you need to use it. That's a slight change in question, right? But my goodness, is that a huge difference in impact? It's a huge difference in impact. But just go ask Google, right? Well, which experts do you want to rely on? You want to rely on those that are actually producing the data and networking that way and working with them, or working with a bunch of search engine algorithms that are giving you based on most likely, most used, most viewed, most connected, which might not really be connected to the data, but connected to the science behind those decisions. Which is why we essentially are going our own route. So this is actually a platform offered through Kansas State Research and Extension. This is a project that I direct. Wendy Johnson is a coordinator of this project. We've been working with other departments on campus. But it's really about thinking about how we do our extension experience. How do we get that information to growers? And this really has to be a customizable experience. Again, this slide is going to get complicated quick, but I want you to focus along the top. Again, we need our stakeholders to be really engaged, and this needs to be easy. So I need to select a variety or hybrid. I then plant the field, and then what else do? I'm going to scout it or make some decisions, and then if I need to, right, that's an add need to, I might make that decision, and then I'm going to harvest it. Have we changed anything in which they do? No. The one change we've done is now we're going to start adding some decision support tools on the background of that. But here's why you need a social network of scientists, from agronomists, plant pathologists, entomologists, soil scientists, water specialists, you name the specialists. That's why this needs to be here under the background running and not some Google search engine. You're starting to connect pieces of data together, and why those pieces of data matter could affect another part of your predictive model, for example. Those pieces do matter, not just I searched for it, I got it. That can happen, but not until we think about their data as being a major driver of this model. That their data is of value. I didn't say it's empirical data that can be put into a science publication. Maybe if you had thousands upon thousands of points and you could model that amount of variability. But the data is important to their experience, to understanding whether our models were actually predictive. Was this useful? Yes or no? That's one question. You read a publication. So what? What did you use? How did you use it? Did this answer a question? All those things you don't know by simply giving them something. If you make it interactive, a two-way street, that data, this little black box, and oftentimes it's very uncertain. What do we do with it? But feeds into what we do as far as an extension service. And we've tested this with growers. And we actually ask them, right? So diffusion of innovation theories, you're going to have some people that are going to be the true early adopters. They're going to be champions of this product. But you're also going to have people that maybe and will never use it, right? So you have this kind of bell curve of people. And the way we just view the world in general, our ability to change or adapt to new technologies, that's just there, right? But if you start building in a way that's more useful to them, all of a sudden you start asking them their willingness to create an account. At that time when we did this, the site didn't exist. You tell them what we're doing, and they're more likely to create an account for something that's not there yet. So we felt this was a really good model. We've been working on this particular model. And I think the more important piece in this is that 89% of the people we polled, I think that was close to 230 people by the time we had these small group working sessions, they're more likely to use it if it's more easily accessed. You're kind of like, yeah, and? I guess my yeah, and is we don't do that yet. We don't do that yet. We can complicate the knowledge base, and that's there. That's why you're here, right? To expand your horizon, to be thinking differently. But you think about that in somebody who's really managing that piece of ground, that's looked at as uncertainty and risk, not knowing the answers to some of these things. And then when you get frustrated when they're just using a product, and I've done this, I've gotten frustrated, and I tell them, there's no risk, don't use the product. But the bean prices are so high, they're going to use it anyway, because they only need to recover a quarter of a bushel to pay for that cost. But there's an environmental cost to that. There's also a cost to increase in the chances of a resistant population so that when you do need it, you don't have access to it. There are other risks that we need to be incorporating. But you can't just do that in one little publication that pushes the information without taking data back. So again, let's just take a real-world tool example. The way we traditionally do this is maybe a piece of paper that has, in this case, it's speed scouting. So there's a mathematical relationship between the number of plants that are infested with 40 or more aphids and whether or not you need to treat that field, okay? And it's pluses and minuses. We try to simplify this as much as we can. Look at 11 plants. Yes, no, no, yes. Add them up. If it falls within these, don't treat, continue, treat, okay? For the most part, it's a pretty simple form. And actually, when we give this form for green bug and wheat, where there's actually a parasitoid involved, they actually miscalculate this quite a bit because you use the parasitoid number first before you look at the aphids. So the advantage of going digital and thinking about this in a digital format is you take this one question here, right? Find your method, soybean aphid, you can learn something about it, but it takes it and says, of that first 11 stops, just tell me the number of times you saw an aphid density over 40 or more. In this case, I found how many? 1, 2, 3, 4. I just looked at 11 plants, found 4, and it told me do not treat based on the aphid count. It's the exact same activity. Now what do I have though? What do I have as a researcher, as Brian with my cap on? What do I have here that I don't have on the paper? Data. What kind of data? What does this data tell me? It says do not treat based on aphid count. Are aphids present? Are aphids present? At high numbers? No. They're present, not at high numbers, and I get enough of those people together to say, hey, in an area, this is how much activity there is with the pests that you're interested in. Now we can actually start crowdsourcing this because this has a geolocation in the background. Actually, what we can do is add a lot of things in the background. Remember that really complicated and wave my hands a lot's part of the speech towards the beginning to make things confusing and overwhelming? Remember that part? That's still happening. That's still happening in the background when I tell you Okay, this time it was 3 to 4 days. You got to treat though. This is a different decision, different field. But now, well, what if I ask one little question about vertical distribution? Where is that happening within the canopy? Or what's the plant stage? What's the leaf age? What about natural enemies, temperature forecasts, immigration events, or maybe even automated counts? What about all these other things that I can start to pull in without you knowing? Simply to tell you, what's the likelihood of 3 or 4 days actually being a reality? It says treat now, but based on where you are, based on the growth stage, that's going to go away. You should actually resample before you spray. Okay, I can't do that in a sheet, in a print off. I can't do that. What I can do is that same activity with that data, I can add all these other things in the background to help understand what that data means, to interpret, to connect that to knowledge, right? Knowledge base that we have. Or, in this case, I might want to then prioritize which fields I want to sample. In this case, we can pull in crop data layer into the site. If you tell us where the location is, we can tell you what the complexity of the landscape, and that's related to biocontrol service. Biocontrol services are available to you based on where that field is. So now if you're managing, say, 10,000 acres of soybean as a consultant, and you want to prioritize your fields, if you put your fields in here, hit calculate, prioritize, it'll list the ones that are most likely to have aphids. It didn't tell you, yes, without a doubt, you got to have aphids. And that's where we fail sometimes when we get in our research brain, is we think the solution has to be quite complicated and has to be absolutely perfect. When really, there's a lot of really simple questions that need to be answered now in order to get the more complicated data. And this is simply, think about what they need to do, which is prioritize their fields. Right? So prioritize, and then you start bringing that all together. You can start thinking about model building. And maybe after 16 years of investment, right, in integrated pest management, where you're not just looking at insecticides, you're looking at host plant resistance, natural enemies, thresholds, all these other pieces to an integrated approach. All of a sudden, oh, and then by the way, there's an introduction of, an accidental introduction of an introduced parasitoid that does a really good job on aphids. We'll start to bring these down to some level of stability in the system, right? They're going to persist. These fluctuations will be up and down in some areas, but for the most part, it's around some tolerable level. But in order for ecosystem services to be there, you have to have prey, right? You have to have prey. Remember I asked you what a pest was? In many cases, your best beneficial is an aphid. Oh, growers have a hard time when I say that one, right? Your best beneficial in this particular situation where you're relying on predation is an aphid. That's your best organism to have out there. You take the aphid away, where do the predators go? What do they feed on? They don't exist, right? You create more isolated patches where they do exist, and they don't go where they need to be. Especially when you start thinking about the resilience of a system. How resilient is a system when you remove all the aphids from it, or from just the environment you're trying to manage? Let's try that. Let's disrupt it. We have a new invasive in sorghum. 3 years ago, we had 40 to 50% fewer acres planted because of one introduced pest, because it costs 15 to 20 bucks an acre to treat it. Natural enemies are really, right, they're still kind of learning how to respond to these new prey items that they haven't had to invest their progeny into before. So this is going to take time to get over this, right? But a disruptor will tell you how resilient your system is to respond. So having aphids out there at low levels to keep predators around, you're much more likely to have a responsive system. It's much more likely to be resilient. Or it could recover from something like this in a much shorter period of time, especially when you start integrating practices. And I promise when I'm done talking that I will do the scheduled scan. Right, but this is a migratory pest. So all those other pieces that we talked about before was soybean aphid. Right, it's a new aphid, it's a new invasive. We can actually learn from that. But here's the cool part, I think is the cool part. It gets me really excited. We didn't have social networks when we did soybean aphid when we first started. It was email and phone calls, right? We did the face-to-face. That's what we did. But now we have the technology in place for a system that I just got done talking about for an invasive species. All of a sudden, we map this in real time using my fields. We know where this thing is going to be because it overwinters in the south. And if I'm going to tell a grower when to go out and scout, it's based on people telling me in Texas that this is out and moving. And I've got a climatologist looking at weather patterns to tell us where this thing is going. That's what we're working on. That's the type of response we can do now because the technology is there. But there's other right? There's other emerging technologies that are coming on board. Right? So you heard Trevor talk about unmanned aircrafts and drones and the differences between that. And does anybody look familiar in that picture? Just see if anybody pays attention here to the. Right, so here's Trevor, right? We talked about that system. And my interest in this is really more from a sampling perspective. You think about how many have seriously walked 100 acres of sorghum, like walked in the field 100 acres of sorghum? So you're going to, yeah, what's it like?
It's awful.
It's awful, yeah. There's no other word for it. I'm sorry, but awful. If you have to walk through all 100 acres to find nothing, how likely are you to do that experience again? Think about that. If you spend all that time to find nothing, and that's what you're trying to do, you're trying to find nothing, the chances of you doing that again are much, much lower. But it's really imperative. If you don't, you're going to lose 70 to 80% of your yield if you miss the outbreak. So this, to me, is where the technology is really exciting. Because we can start asking questions about where and when should we deploy these, and can we actually locate areas of interest without physically having to go to these places to increase our efficiency and our ability to detect these things early on in a much shorter period of time. And can we use these for remote tests? Can we be doing some things where if physically I needed to be on the other side of the field to collect a sample that was maybe pathogenic, where I could actually clip it, bring it back? Right, so thinking about the technology in a different way. Before it was the social media part, now I'm transitioning into emerging technologies and how we still need to be thinking about blending the ecology. See the my fields pop up? Right? All this is going to require, where do I deploy? Well, it depends on what you're growing, depends on what growth stage, depends on what you're looking for. All these things still apply. So you look at sugarcane aphid, for example, we could be looking at this from different levels. We could go from satellite down to manned aircraft at 7,000 feet. We could even do fixed wing to cover an even smaller area, higher resolution. These are all the questions that we start asking. And many times it might be to classify outside of the managed space. Or we're using a multi-rotor to say, hey, let's look at several meters, maybe 100 meters above the canopy, and then bring our perspective down to help us understand, can we use the technology to find those areas of interest? In that case, we're maybe not using UAS. We don't want to replace what we can currently do just as well in other areas for cheaper. Or can we actually use it to do some diagnostics? So a case study, for example. What's the more immediate value we can get out of UAS? Well, this is satellite data. Looking at a soybean field near Mortimer through time. And what do you see? What do you see in these images? So this is about a month in between each one, because that's when the cloud cover. We could have gotten more, but the cloud cover was not ideal. It means we didn't have images between those times. What do you see happening? So you look at this picture and this picture and this picture. This was in, if you can't see it, first part of June, middle of July, towards the end of August.
The last one's much less uniform.
The last one is less uniform, meaning there's more red. In this case, red is bad, low biomass, and that changes as you go kind of south, right? So your orientation is north as you go south. But that isn't necessarily there a month before. And here, the biomass is really low because it's probably only a couple weeks planted. Right? So you have to know something about planting date, when it's taken, all these things. But this, to me, was really interesting. I actually gave my undergrad, who's got a certificate to fly US, to collect data for us, gave him the Mavic Pro to go out and ground truth this. So he spent no time in this field, came back, 20 minutes of flight, 40 images later, and 10 minutes of flipping through images, came back to tell me what the problem was. So again, a few transects to cover this gradient, to see what was happening, where he would have had to walk all the way to the corner of the field to see something, nothing, or not known. So it might be kind of washed out, but you can see a canopy. This is actual image from the Mavic Pro at about 3 meters above the canopy. It's hard to see that. Is there a light? Is that right? Just temporarily, because it's just kind of important part to make the point here. Okay, what do you see in the image? Anything? Look at the leaves. Seeing some holes here and there? Okay. Okay, let's zoom in. Now, are you starting to see anything? It's okay to say no. It's okay to say no. Well, maybe we don't have enough data yet, so let's look at the next image. Here's again, unrestricted shot, now further south in the green areas where there's more biomass. Do you see a difference in the image between that one and this one? See the structure of the leaves? Are they the same or different? Different. Here, they also almost look like they're starting to cup or crinkle. You look here, they seem to be extending out, especially when you zoom in, you don't see that crinkling, right? So 20 minutes of flight, 40 images, all geo-reference, came back to tell me, well, it looks like there's some type of herbicide injury on the north side of the field, and that reduces. And I said, yeah, I know, there's dicamba drift. I just wanted to see if you could see it. So, right, immediate use of the technology, replacing kind of what we're currently doing, or supplementing to be more efficient. To get to, well, how can I take a near-infrared image of that and be more predictive about that? Is yes, that I'm more definitive that that's really drift. What I'm asking is, but we can get there, but do we need to get there right now? Can we be working on those more simple solutions to commercialize the technology? And I think we can. We're trying to replace, hey, we put some stickers on some leaves. Can you see the leaf in the image that has a blue sticker on it? Raise your hand once you find it. Given my time, I might not give you that much time. But again, we're doing those experiments where you walk around in the plot, see how many you can find. We give you a set of images. How many do you find? Looking at efficiency rates. Can you actually detect what we asked you to detect? Now, if I just change some of the relationships to bands, do you see anything pop out? Do you see the blue now? Anybody see the blue? Here's the cool part is I can just force you to see smaller images so you don't have to spend all this time, where do I look, right? It's the same image, but it's segmented. So now we can actually start talking about standard surveillance. That's practices, right? We can standardize that process by using an image. Or we can start to think about ways of optimizing this, not just taking an image from above the canopy. We can actually start looking below. So here's Trevor on the maiden voyage of the bobber. It's just like it sounds, right? Just like a bobber, right? You put it in the water and you bring it back out. Same thing with the soybean. You're not bringing it through the canopy. You're popping it in, bringing it back out. We wanted to first see if we could fly, so we had to engineer something. So I bought $5 of PVC and a $150 GoPro camera and some duct tape. You basically have an arm. As the UAS lifts up, you have an elbow joint. Too easy, right? Why would you do that? Why would you do that? Besides an entomologist needing something else to do. Why would you do that? Why would you want to see what's under the canopy?
To see if just the top part's being affected or the lower part too? Yeah,
that's where the bugs are going to be. Think about it. Why would they be sitting in sunlight why would they be sitting in radiation all day? That might not be the best for their development. So you might want to see what's underneath the canopy. So, right, we developed a GoPro on a stick, several different views. One pointing right at the base of the canopy, one slightly shooting up, and one just above the canopy. And this you can fly on the UAS. But here's what you can see with the GoPro for 150 bucks. What's happening? That's the top view. Should you be concerned? Again, I'm purposely not giving you some of this background information. What's your gut response? What would you say? What's going on? Does this look normal to you? Yeah? So did anybody see these weird patterns on the leaves and say, I wonder if that's supposed to be there? Right? The more you look at this, the more I show you, then you have some background what to look for, right? But for the most part, you could search through these pretty easily. How many saw the lady beetle in here? I didn't tell you to look for a lady beetle. Did I? No, I said, what do you see? What's going on in here? So right away, you can start picking out things without me telling you. You can actually get quite a bit of information in one snapshot. And sure enough, that's actually a 7 spot based on the pattern where it's at. I feel pretty confident that's a 7 spot. That's from a camera, but here's the Here's that same shot, but underneath the canopy. So it's not just a coccinelle that's there just to be there. There's actually an aphid population developing in the lower part of the canopy that I couldn't see from an aerial perspective. And if I can't capture that with near infrared from the top leaves because it's a bottom leaf, then actually I'm using this technology to get a different view. Right? That's probably a problem. It's a little bit washed out, but you can actually see some predators. You got some development. So that's some ecology happening here by a simple snapshot under the canopy. And you can start to look at gaps, like there should be a plant here. Why isn't there a plant here? Can I calculate based on distance, focal distance? I can start to get plant stand counts and other data from this that I, again, might not get by simply walking out there because 100 acres is a lot to walk. So that was the GoPro. You're probably saying that's fine, but what about the Mavic? So this is what you can see from the Mavic. This is what you can see from that little UAS, no bigger than one that Trevor brought in. Here's what you can see. Sooty mold, sticky honeydew, bottom part of the canopy, a few feet away, right? But the other piece that I can get that I can't get by simply walking to that point is I can get an aerial perspective. Again, I can look down, but then I can simply go up 120 feet, maybe 200 feet, and actually figure out what's happening with some of these drowned out areas. In this case, it was water. Was it chinch bug or water? Chinch bug is usually not going to follow a terrace like that. Water will, and plus we saw some other evidence of water being a problem here, which is why we had poor emergence. So we can actually use the technology to diagnose some other things. Or we can add a suction device to it. It sucks out bugs. You stick it on a UAS. It's another tool. Just don't talk about images, right? But as with most technologies, it's a tool. It's not the solution. It's not the way you get to the moon. Right? It helps you get there, but you need a plan and you need people. You need data. You need to be thinking about it as more of a multi-purpose tool. As with most of these technologies, that's one of those take-home messages is yes, it's great, it's cool. There's a lot of things you can do with it, but it's the people that are making those connections. And working with those growers, like I talked about with Charlie at the beginning, right? Working with not only growers in our own country, but in another country where they might have an invasive that we're interested in detecting. Remember I said one disruptor can completely change the system? You want to be looking for zeros. It's really difficult to get them to look for zeros, let alone pests that are known and established. If you want to classify it as an invasive-free space, you have to go out there and look, right? And that takes time and a lot of people. If you can start to automate some of that process by getting them involved, you can start to look at that data in a different way. They might be collecting it for one pest, but you're actually looking at it for another. So this is something we've always done within extension, right, is the way we communicate. We take the technology of the time and take it to the people where they are. At this time, it was actually the seed corn gospel train. I like this image because here's the germination test from 1910. The technology at the time, which was really frightening to people, was railroad. People didn't even want to get on those things, right? You think about UAS in a similar way. Very early on in its emergence into the scene was what? No, surveillance. People are going to spy on me. All these other fears about it, right? But you have to take the technology, let you see what you can see with the UAS. How do you incorporate that into your daily activities? Take the technology at the time to them, and think about platforms that really integrate the data process. I share data with you, you share data with me. So I'm not sure if I got time for questions, but I do appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all this morning. So. Yeah.
Maybe if you've got some time.
Yeah, I do. Yep, I do.
Address a few questions, this might help to get
Yep.
to a different
Yep,
place.
no worries.
So thank you.
Like, yeah, I've got 10 minutes to go across. Yes.
A little bit unrelated, this is more for personal knowledge. Have you guys seen with pesticides and stuff affecting insect populations, therefore affecting native bird species? Like introduced birds?
Introduced birds?
And native, both, like prairie and stuff even?
It's a good question. Our lab hasn't looked at that. Some of the products we look at, especially with the sugarcane aphid, are some of the at least gentler insecticides on natural enemies. So the way the product works is the aphid has to actually suck on the plant to get some of the toxin. So unless a lot of the birds are feeding on the aphids that are feeding on there, in many cases, some of the newer chemistries are a little bit more conducive to that.
I didn't know if the insects that eat the aphids were dying too from eating aphids.
That's a current area of research, not for me, but for some others. There could be some sublethal effects for sure. Definitely potential pollination interactions at the time of which you apply an insecticide. That could be getting into pollen. So what kind of impacts on native pollinator communities still needs to be addressed. Yeah. Yes. Good question though. Questions? All right. Thank you.